Howdy folks, today we're going to be talking about a very important question. We're coming up on Easter, and the question we're going to be discussing is Easter pagan? This is a question that should be of concern to all Christians, whether you're Catholic or Protestant or Eastern Orthodox or anything else, because Easter is the most important Christian holiday of all. It's even more important than Christmas. Christmas, of course, celebrates the incarnation of Christ our Savior, and Easter celebrates his resurrection following his crucifixion on Good Friday. Now, in some circles, it's been claimed that Easter is really of pagan origin, and advocates of this view cite a number of arguments in favor of that. We're going to take a look at them, and we're going to take a look at where Easter actually comes from. One of the first kinds of arguments that people use when they advocate the Easter is pagan view is frequently the fact that Easter is often associated with symbols like rabbits and eggs and baby chickens, chicks, and ducklings and things like that. And sometimes people say, oh, these are fertility symbols, and that shows us that this is a pagan holiday. Well, if you think about it, Easter is celebrated in the springtime, and spring is when nature gets fertile again after the rigors of winter. And so these are all spring symbols, and you would expect a holiday that occurs in the spring to have spring symbols associated with it, just as you would expect holidays that occur in the summer to have summer symbols, holidays that occur in the fall to have autumn symbols, and holidays that occur in the winter to have winter symbols. So the association on a kind of folk culture level of Easter with things like bunnies or eggs or chicks or ducklings proves that Easter occurs in the spring, but it doesn't prove that it's pagan. Now, in the case of eggs, there's also a special reason why eggs are associated with Easter. And the reason is that during much of Christian history, Christians in many lands would give up all animal products, including meat and milk and eggs, for Lent. Lent is the period on the church's calendar that leads up to Easter, and it symbolizes the 40 days that Jesus spent in the desert preparing for his earthly ministry, a ministry that then culminated in his death and resurrection. And so, to prepare themselves for the celebration of his death and resurrection, Christians in many places have had this custom of giving up animal products, including eggs. Now, not as many Christians today do that as in the past, but in the past, people would, and there is a certain fact about egg production that may not always be obvious to people today, because we go to the supermarket to buy our eggs, most of us, and so it's not as obvious to us, but it would be very obvious to the people back then that chickens don't stop laying just because it's Lent. So they keep producing eggs all the way through Lent. Many of them, of course, many of the eggs, of course, would go bad, because this was before refrigeration. But still, by the end of Lent, you're going to have a lot of eggs that you need to get rid of that are still good. And so it would be very natural, once the great day of celebration comes and you can celebrate by having meat and milk and eggs, to use up those eggs. And so that's one reason that eggs in particular became a symbol connected with Easter. Now, there are other arguments that are used, and some of them are based on the name Easter itself. For example, if you read some authors, they'll say, well, the fact that Easter is pagan is shown just by the name itself, because, they'll say, it's derived from the goddess Ishtar. And you can even hear the similarity between Easter and Ishtar. It would seem obvious that they're the same thing, or that they're derived, they're connected. Well, this is, we're going to see, an example of what linguists refer to as a false etymology. An etymology is the origin of a word, just like the word Christian, for example, comes from the Greek word Christos, which means Christ, or the word pagan comes from the Latin word paganus, which means a person who lives in the country, because, there was more communication in cities where people live close together. And so when Christianity began to spread, it reached the cities first. People could talk to each other and exchange ideas, and it took more time to reach the people in the country. And so the people who lived there, the individual paganas, was not as likely to have heard about Christianity as quickly. And so the word pagan actually ends up coming from a word that means a person who dwells in the country. Those are examples of real etymologies that scholars have studied and we know the backgrounds of. But one of the persistent dangers of doing etymological work is that there are a lot of false etymologies that are out there. They're kind of the equivalent of urban legends. And scholars do a lot of research to try to find out the true origin of words. And sometimes things can be misleading. And the case of Ishtar and how it sounds like Easter is one of those things. It could seem, just if you know nothing else and you're just speculating based on the sounds of the word, it could seem like they're connected. But if you dig a little deeper, you find out that that's really implausible. Ishtar was a goddess. She was an Akkadian goddess, and what that means is she was worshipped in Mesopotamia, or what we today would call Iraq. Also, the Akkadians, now they spoke Akkadian, that was their language, and Akkadian is a Semitic language. That means it belongs to the same language family as Hebrew and Aramaic and Egyptian. English, the language where we call Easter Easter, on the other hand, is not spoken, at least historically, it was not spoken in Iraq. It developed in England, and it's related to certain other languages, but it's not a Semitic language, it's a Germanic language. And so it belongs to the same language family as German and Dutch and Swedish. Now, if you know a little bit about the ancient world, or if you want to do a little research, you could go look at some maps and so forth, you'll see that Iraq is kind of a long way away from England. And there just aren't the kind of cultural and linguistic connections between ancient Mesopotamia and England that would allow the worship and the name of this goddess to get transferred from all the way over there to all the way over there. It's very unlikely, and so there are no scholars who take the idea seriously that the name Easter comes from Ishtar. But some other people will say, okay, maybe not Ishtar, but still a pagan goddess. And they'll point to one named Eostre. Where they get this is from a British scholar and saint who lived in the 8th century. His name was Bede, and he's commonly called the Venerable Bede. And he wrote a very famous work called The Ecclesiastical History of the British People. He described a lot of things going on in his day in England and before. And one of the things he talks about is a particular calendar that was in use locally. And one of the months on this calendar was named Eostre Monath. Now, Bede's audience didn't necessarily know where this word came from or what it meant, and so he offers an explanation. He offers an etymology for where the name of the month, Eostre Monath, came from. And Bede says that the name of the month was based on a goddess that had previously been worshipped in England. Remember, he's writing in Christian times, but he's talking about before that. And he says that there was this goddess that some of the tribes worshipped, named Eostre, and this was her month, basically equivalent to the month of April, which is when Easter commonly falls. And so even though people had worshipped Eostre in this month before, now they worship according to the Christian calendar, and this is when the Paschal festival falls, and we'll talk about that word in a minute. But that's when Easter is, and so that's what's celebrated then now. Well, some people have said, okay, there was this goddess named Eostre, and for a while that had a good bit of traction, at least starting in the 19th century, in some linguistic circles. There was a particular linguist named Jakob Grimm who read Bede's account and tried to reconstruct what the name of that goddess would have been if she had been worshipped more broadly by Germanic tribes outside of England. And he suggested that her name most probably would have been Ostara. Now, Grimm is someone you may have heard of, although you may not know it. He did a lot of very important work in linguistics, and with his brother Wilhelm, he did a lot of very important work in fairy tales. This is one of the two brothers Grimm, and they, wrote books of folklore and literature and fairy tales, including such classics as Hansel and Gretel, and Rapunzel, and Cinderella, and Snow White, and just marvelous children's literature. But it seems that despite what Jakob thought, based on Bede's account, that the idea that there even ever was a goddess named Eostre is just a fairy tale. And a lot of scholars today think that there simply was no such goddess. The reason is that Bede, despite the fact he's very venerable, is the only person to mention this goddess. He's the only one. There are no other mentions. Now, we have mentions of lots of other Germanic gods and goddesses, like Odin or Wotan, to give another form of his name, and Thor, and Freya, and Baldur, and all kinds of other Germanic gods and goddesses, but not Eostre. And since Bede is talking about a time before his own, and there are no etymological dictionaries in his day, and you couldn't just look this up on Wikipedia. He's working with limited knowledge about a time before his own, and he very likely got this wrong. He's the only person who mentions this. By the way, you'll notice he's the only person, he feels the need to explain what this month is to his audience, in fact. So it's not like he's counting on people to have heard of this goddess, otherwise it would be pretty obvious. So it would seem that that there likely was no such goddess. But let's suppose there was. And let's suppose Bede's entirely right, that that's where the name Easter comes from. Well, that would prove that the word Easter is of pagan origin. But would that prove that Easter itself is of pagan origin? Well, let's ask this question. If the word Eostre was invented in England, and that maybe has some cognates, related words, in other Germanic lands, was Easter invented in England or other Germanic lands? Well, there the answer is very clearly no, and so here's where Easter really comes from. Easter is the celebration, as we said, of Jesus Christ's resurrection from the dead. Now, he was crucified on the Jewish holiday of Passover. So the timing of Easter is closely related to the timing of Passover. In Hebrew, the word for Passover is Pesach, and Christians began using this word to also indicate the celebration of the Lord's resurrection. And so it passed into the Greek language as Pascha, and it passed into Latin as Pascha. And in fact, today, if you go to Greece, you'll find people referring to Easter as Pascha. And if you read church documents in Latin, it'll be referring to Easter as Pascha. From there, it passed into the Romance languages like Italian as Pasqua. And in Spanish, it's also Pasqua. In French, it's Pâques. And so the evolution of the term in all these different languages reveals the true origin of the celebration of Easter. It's really only if your native language is English or maybe German that you would be tempted to think that Easter is of pagan origin. But its name in all of these other languages shows its true origin. It's not pagan, it's Christian, based on the Jewish celebration of Passover. So, having said that, having looked at where Easter really comes from, despite whatever name it's called in any given language, I'd like to wish you all a happy Easter.